Welcome to this week's edition of Ask an MS Expert. I'm John Strum, and I'm the host of the Real Talk MS podcast. Each week, Real Talk MS reaches thousands of people in more than 100 countries around the world with the news that people affected by MS need to know. My wife, Jean, lived with progressive MS for 23 years. So I've had a front row seat experiencing all the ways that MS can impact a family. Currently, I serve on the MS Society's Community Review of MS Research Committee. I'm a district activist leader and trustee for the National MS Society, and I chair the Society's California Government Relations Advisory Committee. The MS Society's Ask an MS Expert webcast is designed to give us a place for the MS community to connect and to connect you with experts who are ready to answer your questions on the topics that impact people affected by MS every day. Please feel free to post your comments and questions on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitch. MS navigators are online throughout today's program, answering those questions and connecting you to resources. Integrative medicine brings conventional and complementary treatments together in a coordinated way. This type of approach to health and wellness represents a growing trend across the United States, especially among people living with a chronic disease like MS. Dr. Lynne Shinto is with us today to explain what integrative medicine is all about. We'll talk about its effectiveness and how to safely use complementary treatments in MS care. Dr. Shinto is a professor in the Department of Neurology at Oregon Health and Science University, where her research focus is complementary, alternative, and integrative medicine. Welcome, Dr. Shinto. Thanks for being with us today.
Hi, John. It's a pleasure to be here.
Before we dive in, I'm hoping you can help clarify what the terms complementary, alternative, and integrative mean. I know they're sometimes used interchangeably, but do they all mean the same thing?
That's a great question, John. They don't all mean the same thing. So complementary means non-conventional with conventional medicine. For example, you could take vitamin D with a MS disease modifying therapy, and vitamin D would be complementary to the conventional disease modifier. Alternative means non-conventional or in place of conventional. So using that same example, if you only use the vitamin D for disease progression and you didn't use the disease modifier, vitamin D would be considered an alternative treatment in MS. Most people with MS use complementary medicine for MS or integrative. So that's using the complementary and the conventional therapies for MS.
So, how are complementary and alternative medicine different from conventional medicine?
That's a great question too. So I would say that the first thing is that for complementary medicine, there are less scientific studies evaluating its effectiveness and safety than conventional medicine. So there are way less clinical trials. And because of that, there is less sort of known evidence base for complementary alternative medicine. I think the second thing is for conventional medicine, the FDA has regulations around conventional drugs like the disease modifying drugs, or like, let's say, an antidepressant like Zoloft. The FDA has regulations around those drugs. They are FDA indicated or on label. For a lot of the dietary supplements, because of the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, or we just call this DSHEA, in 1994, this is a US law that defines and regulates dietary supplements, and the regulation is not the same as an FDA regulation on a conventional medication. It places dietary supplements in a category that's distinct from foods and drugs. It allows supplements to be marketed without pre-approval from the FDA, as long as they don't claim to diagnose, treat, or cure or prevent any disease. So for example, let's take vitamin D. Vitamin D if there was a claim on the label that it treats MS, the FDA would take that off the market. But it can say anything else, it can be used for wellness or something non-specific, and that can be allowed on the market. So the other thing is that there is, even though the FDA is not regulating many of the dietary supplements, under DSHEA, supplement manufacturers are responsible for ensuring their products are safe before marketing them. And the FDA has the authority to remove unsafe dietary supplements. For example, in the early 2000s, there was an herbal used for energy and weight loss called ephedra. And there were reports of serious side effects, heart attacks, even deaths. And because of that, the FDA removed ephedra from the market, and it is no longer on the market. Having said all that, there are many dietary supplements that are on the market that we need to pay attention to and be careful of, but many of them are safe. And if they're not, the FDA does regulate that.
Of which you started to answer my next question by giving us that example earlier of vitamin D along with the DMT. I was hoping you could share some other examples of common integrative health approaches for treating MS.
Sure. So there are many complementary therapies that are commonly used with DMTs or with other, MS symptomatic drugs, and they seem to be very safe. And so this would include yoga, kind of mindfulness or breathing techniques for stress reduction. There are many people with MS who use specific diets, like a low saturated fat diet, the Walls diet, with, disease modifying drugs or other drugs. And this would be an example of common integrative health approaches for people with MS.
According to the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health, about 37% of US adults use some form of integrative medicine. Why do you suppose there's so much interest in this approach to healthcare?
I think there's a big interest in wellness and a holistic approach. So I think a lot of people, they're very satisfied with their conventional therapies and their conventional doctors, but there's always room for improvement, right? And everybody likes to feel a little bit more empowered. So I think people really want to feel well, and they want to feel that they're doing everything they can for their health. They want to look at their whole body, approach things in a very whole body, holistic way. And conventional medicine traditionally addresses a disease state or a symptom. So I think this sort of move to a more positive, more empowered, sort of the person, is the driver. When you do a diet, you don't need a prescription for that. You control that. And diets in general, even outside of MS, are healthy. So I think that sort of holistic, empowering feeling is one of the reasons why integrative medicine is becoming very popular.
We heard from Scott, and he's asking what the benefits and risks of integrative medicine are.
Okay, I mentioned some of these when answering the previous question. I'm going to start with the benefits. So again, I think holistic care are some of the benefits. Taking account of the whole person, not just the disease state, not just a symptom. We're looking at mind, body, and spiritual wellness rather than treating symptoms and disease. I think that's a real benefit of integrative medicine. It's very patient-centered. Treatment plans are tailored to the individual needs, preferences, values of the patient, and the patient is empowered. When they learn about a specific diet for MS that could be helpful, or they want to do a different kind of movement like yoga, this is very empowering, and this puts the patient in the driver's seat rather than just as a recipient of things that someone tells them that they need to do. I think the other thing is that integrative medicine really focuses on promoting health and also in preventing, you know, your health to get worse. But this promoting health piece, I think, is one of the benefits.
Any
For the
risks to
risks,
consider?
yeah, for the risks, I sort of would like to reframe the word risk to barrier because some of the risks aren't true risks, but they are barriers. One of the barriers, which I already talked about, is that compared to conventional medicine, there are very few large studies in integrative medicine therapies as single therapies or as combined therapies. For example, evaluating diet in MS, there's a handful of small published studies. Most show benefit, but we don't have these big, large studies that we have in some of the MS-DMTs. And so I think that is one of the barriers is that the scientific effectiveness and risks aren't fully known. Many people do multiple therapies. They do multiple complementary alternative therapies, and there are extremely few studies looking at multi-component CAM therapies in MS. So in general, clear scientific evidence-based recommendations are difficult. And this is difficult for a patient, and it's difficult for providers when they're making recommendations.
Sure.
The other big barrier is cost. So many complementary therapies like dietary supplements or seeing an acupuncture, or even I'm a naturopath, seeing a naturopath are not covered by insurance. And this is an out-of-pocket cost. And sometimes that cost can be, high.
Well, I just heard you mention acupuncture, and we heard from Jenna, who tells us she's considering acupuncture treatment to help her with MS-related numbness, pain, and spasticity. But she has a couple of questions before she's ready to fully commit. First, she wants to know, is acupuncture safe for people with MS? And Jenna also wants to know how you assess the possible risks associated with acupuncture or any complementary therapy.
Okay, acupuncture, the first thing I want to say is if you have acupuncture done, you need to see a licensed acupuncturist. And there are some national databases for people who are licensed in acupuncture and I can put this in a resource later on, that people can access to see who is a licensed acupuncturist. I think it's really important when you're doing a therapy like acupuncture that, you have someone who is trained, well trained. The other way to find a licensed acupuncture is your healthcare provider. Many medical schools and hospitals now have acupuncturists within their outpatient and even some inpatient care. So your PCP might know of an acupuncturist that they can recommend. And actually, family and friends are good resources for seeing an acupuncturist. You may have a friend or family member who actually gets acupuncture, maybe for low back pain, and they really have had benefit, and they trust that person. So that's another resource for finding an acupuncturist. There have been actually quite a number of trials in low back pain, not necessarily in MS, but for low back pain. And it is very safe in low back pain. In general, clinical trials in acupuncture, the risks are very mild, and serious adverse events are extremely rare. I would say that the main side effects are you're using these very fine needles. So sometimes there's a little bleeding where the needles are placed. Sometimes there's a small bruise. This would be transient. Sometimes people feel sleepy during their treatment and maybe a little tired or sleepy after treatment. This is also usually transient. That feeling normally goes away. I would say these are the main risks, and they're very, very mild, low risk.
Well, Jenna says she's also interested in learning what other complementary therapies might be good for managing numbness, pain, and spasticity.
In MS, there's some scientific evidence to support cannabinoids off-label for spasticity. The research is mixed. And then there is limited evidence for using low-dose naltrexone in MS and fibromyalgia. And we can talk about that later on.
Be happy to circle back to that. We've also heard from Michelle, who wants to know if there are integrative therapies to help keep her brain healthy and prevent future cognitive impairment.
Yes, I get asked that a lot. And for me, the pillars to brain health are a healthy diet, being active, so movement, physical activity, and stress reduction. So for some people, that actually is physical activity, is their stress reducer. Like for me, that's my stress reducer. For others, it could be breathwork techniques. It could be, mindfulness practice. But however way someone feels comfortable coping with stress, those coping skills are really important for brain health. And I think often people forget that stress, I think especially in MS, is not good for the brain.
Tyler's asking if there's an integrative medicine approach that can help manage his MS related fatigue.
Sure, I get asked that a lot. And for me, my first go-to is diet. There is evidence that several diets actually improve, scientific evidence that several diets improve fatigue in MS. The different diets that have shown this are the Overcoming MS diet, which is mostly a plant-based diet, plant-based, whole grain. Fish is allowed, but not red meat or chicken. It's a very healthy diet. The Walls is a modified paleo diet, so it's kind of interesting because it's the opposite of the Overcoming MS diet, but it's also a low processed food, low sugar, red. You can eat red meat, a lot of vegetables. The Walls diet actually has, I think you have to have 9 servings of vegetables a day. And then there's the low saturated fat diet, very low saturated fat, less than 15 grams per day. That diet also has evidence for decreasing MS fatigue. So I usually, because diet has benefits, even if outside of MS, a healthy diet has many benefits for cardiovascular disease, for brain health. I usually recommend some type of healthy, low or no processed food, low or no sugar diet.
We heard from Bella, who agrees with your previous comment that it's important to find specialists who are trained and have the proper qualifications for treating others. Bella wants to know how she should go about finding an integrative medicine provider, not only in the field of acupuncture, but how to find an integrative medicine provider who's an accredited specialist.
Sure. So usually states have licensing boards. And so depending on what the provider is, so for acupuncture, there's state boards that list all the folks that are licensed through their state. And that's one way to find out. In Oregon, we have a licensing board, and you can just type in a name and they'll come up as either being licensed or not for acupuncture. Also for naturopathic medicine, we have the same thing for chiropractors. There's the same state and national level licensing boards or information on the national level about who is licensed or who is not. So that's one way to find out if someone actually has a license. Again, I mentioned that a lot of medical schools or hospital integrative medicine centers, they need to credential their providers. So they're already vetted and they have to have a license, and they even have to have sufficient training and expertise in their field. So if you have a hospital that has an integrated medicine center, that's a good place to go or to start, because those providers are well vetted in what they do. And then again, I also mentioned previously that your medical provider may know of a licensed integrative medicine provider. So, I think it's worth asking your PCP, or if there's a nurse practitioner, a PA that you see, they may know of a licensed integrative medicine provider that they can recommend.
You also mentioned naltrexone a moment ago. It's a drug best known for treating opioid addiction. And because low dose naltrexone is being used as an experimental treatment for MS, it falls into that alternative therapy category. So, what can you tell us about low dose naltrexone?
Yeah. So first, I want to just clarify what the conventional naltrexone is, just because in that context, it's easier to talk about low dose naltrexone. So naltrexone is used conventionally and is FDA approved at a dose of 50 to 100 milligrams for opioid and alcohol substance abuse. And how it works is it binds to opioid receptors, to multiple opioid receptors for a long time, 24 hours. So the difference between naltrexone and low dose naltrexone is used off label. It's used at a dose that's 10 to 15 times lower than the naltrexone dose. So the dose range in clinical trial for low dose naltrexone could be less than a milligram to up to 6 milligrams versus the 50 to 100 milligrams in naltrexone. The usual dose in clinical trials is 1.5 to 4.5 milligrams per day. And at that low dose, instead of binding to the opioid receptors for a long time or for like a day, it temporarily binds to opioid receptors, and more specifically, a specific receptor called the opioid growth factor, or OGF. And when it binds for the short time, um, it will the body will respond by releasing natural endorphins that function to relieve pain. And these natural endorphins are also immunomodulatory. And this is why low-dose naltrexone has gained traction in MS and other pain conditions like fibromyalgia, that, where the immunomodulatory effects might be beneficial. So that is just a description of low-dose naltrexone. It's used off-label. For MS, the studies show no clear indication that it helps with pain or spasticity. But there are studies that show improved quality of life. A lot of these studies are pilot. They have small sample sizes, less than 100 participants. And most of them are short term. So they last from like 2 to 6 months. The dose in clinical trial for MS is 3 to 4.5 milligrams per day. Again, usually short term, 2 months to 6 months. These studies have been done in relapsing remitting and also progressive forms of MS. I want to mention that there is one long-term open label study. So that means that it's not randomized, there's no placebo group. Everybody's getting 3.0 milligrams of low-dose naltrexone. So everybody knows they're on it. But it's a long-term study that's published, and these folks had been taking this dose for 2 years. It's in primary progressive MS. And what they found was that disability scores were stable over 2 years, which, without the comparison group or the placebo group, it's hard to say, would the comparison group show the same? Not clear. But it does show that disability didn't get worse on the low dose naltrexone. So it's a little bit of an indicator that, maybe we need to study this in a more well-designed and rigorous clinical trial. I think all the studies, whether they're in MS or in other groups like rheumatoid arthritis, low-dose naltrexone is well tolerated. The side effects are fairly mild, some of them transient. So they can include fatigue, which is often transient, GI upset, so maybe some nausea, diarrhea, stomach pain. That's usually transient. Vivid dreams is a common side effect, and sometimes people don't mind this. They have vivid dreams, and it's not bothersome, but sometimes this can disturb sleep. So usually if it's vivid dreams, then often the low dose naltrexone is taken during the day and not at bedtime. Headache is a common side effect, and very, very rare reported side effect is body rash. That's not usual.
Well, thank you for sharing your insights about integrative medicine and MS. I'm sure at least some of our viewers are learning about this approach to healthcare for the very first time today. Now I'm hoping you'll share your top takeaway message that you'd like our viewers to remember and put to use.
Yeah, so I have top takeaways. I have four of them. So usually complementary medicine with conventional medicine offers a whole person approach to health. And this can be very empowering, especially with diet, physical activity, and mind body or stress reduction therapies. These are also, these three, like what I called the pillars earlier, seem to be very safe with conventional drug therapies for MS. Uh, Many complementary therapies in MS, I think especially dietary supplements, have not been well studied in clinical trial. So therefore, effectiveness and safety is not well known. Um, the pillars are diet, physical activity or movement, and stress reduction. And these, again, are often safe combined with conventional therapies. And the last takeaway is when seeing a CAM provider, be sure they're licensed and have the expertise in what they are doing.
Well, I want to thank everyone who submitted some excellent questions, and thank you for being with us today, Dr. Shinto.
Thank you, John. It was a pleasure.
Before we close, I want to remind you that the National MS Society's MS Navigator team is your best partner when it comes to connecting you to the very best information and resources on living with MS. You can reach an MS Navigator by phone, email, or through the Society's website by chat. For information and resources on MS, please be sure to visit the Society's website. You'll find research updates and news, information on connection programs like self-help groups and MS Friends. You'll hear about ways that you can get involved, and you'll find out about upcoming events that are taking place near you. Remember, you can connect with the National MS Society and others affected by MS on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And I hope you'll join me every week on the Real Talk MS podcast, where I continue the conversation that we start here. You'll find Real Talk MS at realtalkms.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts. I'd like to thank Dr. Shinto for joining us today. Please remember that a recording of this webcast will be available at the Society's website at nationalmssociety.org/MSexpert, as well as on Facebook and YouTube. I hope you'll join us at this same time for next week's edition of Ask an MS Expert. You can always find our upcoming program topics on the National MS Society's website. And now I have a favor to ask each of you. Getting your feedback on today's webcast is important. So if you're watching on Facebook Live, you'll see a link to a survey pinned to the comments section. On YouTube, you'll find that link in the program description. And on Twitch, you can find the link in the chat. Completing the survey makes a real difference. The information you provide helps us continuously improve, and it helps shape future programs. The survey takes just 1 minute, so I hope you'll take a minute to fill it out. On behalf of Dr. Lynne Shinto and the National MS Society, I want to thank you once again for joining us. Please stay safe and make healthy choices.